The bronze spear tips glint in the Mediterranean sun as the Spartan phalanx advances across the blood-soaked battlefield. Behind them, smoke rises from what was once the proud city of Decelia, its walls reduced to rubble, its defenders scattered like grain before the wind. But this is not a story about the warriors who died with honor that day. This is not about the heroic last stands that poets sing of in marble halls. This is about what happened after the battle ended, when the killing was done, when the real horror began. Because what the Spartans did to the wives of their defeated enemies makes their legendary battlefield brutality seem almost merciful by comparison. What you're about to learn has been deliberately obscured by 25 centuries of scholarship that preferred to focus on Spartan military glory rather than examine the systematic machinery of human exploitation that made that glory possible. Tonight, we strip away the romantic myths and reveal the documented reality that historians have spent generations trying to ignore. The woman stumbling through the ash-covered streets bears a name that history almost forgot. Melina, 26 years old, wife of Hippocrates, one of Athens' most respected military commanders. 3 days ago, she managed a household with 14 slaves, raised 2 healthy sons, lived a life of dignity and purpose in one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Now she walks barefoot on stones still warm from the fires that consumed everything she knew, wearing clothing that belongs to her captors, surrounded by 31 other Athenian women who share her fate. They have been collected. That is the word the Spartans use. Collected like grain after harvest, sorted and transported with the same efficiency they apply to dismantling fortifications. Melina counts them during the forced march south, these wives and daughters and widows of Athenian officers, trying to hold on to something familiar in a world where everything familiar has been stripped away. The counting helps her mind focus on something other than the growing certainty that death might have been the kinder option. The courtyard where they finally stop is not what she expected. Clean flagstones worn smooth by generations of feet, organized colonnades, an efficiency that speaks of systems refined over centuries. This is not the chaotic aftermath of conquest. This is something far more disturbing, something that reveals the true nature of Spartan power. Not mere violence, but violence organized, systematized, perfected into a machine that processes human beings with mechanical precision. Spartan women watch from the shadows, their expressions unreadable. They do not look sympathetic. They do not look cruel. They look evaluating, like horse traders examining stock before auction. Melina begins to understand that she has entered a world where human worth is calculated according to principles she cannot yet comprehend, where her value will be determined by measurements and assessments that reduce her to categories of utility. The man who approaches wears the crimson cloak that marks him as one of the homoioi, the equals, a full Spartan citizen with rights that extend to everything within Laconia's borders, including, Melina realizes with growing horror, herself. He does not introduce himself because his authority requires no introduction. When he speaks, his words are stripped to their essence, consonants bitten off, vowels flattened, every syllable economical in the way that only Spartans manage. His message is simple and devastating. Everything they were has been erased. Athens has fallen. Husbands are dead or enslaved. Children scattered to fates unknown. They are no longer wives, no longer mothers, no longer even Athenian. They are property of the Lacedaemonian state, but not slaves. Slaves, he explains with clinical detachment, have value only for labor. These women have different value entirely. The distribution system he describes sounds like logistics rather than human trafficking. Some will be assigned to Spartan households as secondary wives. Some will be given to the crypteia for training purposes. Some will serve in temples. Some will be used for breeding. The word lands like a physical blow, stripping away any illusions about what their captivity actually means. They are livestock now, valuable for their reproductive capacity, their genetic potential, their ability to produce the next generation of Spartan warriors. The examination that follows is thorough, clinical, utterly dehumanizing. Melina stands in a stone room while an older woman checks her teeth like livestock, examines her hips with hands that probe without apology or explanation. Questions follow about menstrual cycles, previous pregnancies, the health of her sons, whether she has ever miscarried. She answers because refusing will not stop the process, will only make it worse. The woman makes marks on a wax tablet, notations that will determine Melina's fate according to criteria she cannot understand. But this systematic cruelty was not born overnight. To understand what happened to these captured women, we must first understand what created the men who processed them. Sparta became what it was through deliberate design, through generations of social engineering that produced warriors unlike any the ancient world had seen. The transformation began around 650 BCE, when Sparta faced an existential crisis that would reshape their entire civilization. The city had conquered Messenia, enslaving its population to work the fertile lands that fed Spartan citizens. But the Messenians revolted, and the war that followed nearly destroyed Sparta entirely. The leaders who survived drew a conclusion that would echo through centuries. Never again would Sparta be vulnerable. Never again would Spartans concern themselves with farming, commerce, art, philosophy, or any other pursuit that made cities wealthy and creative and weak. The system they created was called the agoge, meaning upbringing or raising, a term that conceals the reality of what it actually involved. Every Spartan male child was examined at birth by a council of elders who determined whether the infant was worthy of life. Those judged weak or deformed were taken to Mount Taygetus and thrown from the cliffs. Those who passed this first selection were permitted to remain with their mothers until age 7. At 7, everything changed. The boys were taken from their families and placed in communal barracks where they would live until age 30. They were organized into groups called agilai, herds, a term that reveals exactly how Spartans viewed their children. Not as individuals to be nurtured, but as livestock to be shaped into useful form through systematic brutalization. The training was designed to produce specific psychological results. Boys were deliberately underfed, forcing them to steal food to survive. If caught stealing, they were beaten not for the theft itself, but for being caught. The lesson was unmistakable. Cunning and deception were virtues. Failure was the only crime. Getting caught meant you were not clever enough to deserve Spartan citizenship. They received 1 cloak per year regardless of weather. They slept on rushes they gathered from riverbanks. They were beaten regularly by older boys and adult supervisors, not as punishment for specific offences, but as general conditioning to endure pain without complaint. A Spartan who cried out under the lash was considered unworthy of citizenship. Most importantly, they fought each other constantly, not play fighting, but genuine combat that produced injuries and occasionally deaths. The survivors were those who learned to channel violence effectively, who could switch from calm to lethal in an instant, who felt no hesitation about causing harm to others. They were systematically denied normal human attachments, taught that sentiment was weakness, that love made you vulnerable, that the only loyalty worth having was loyalty to Sparta itself. By age 18, these young men had spent 11 years in an environment designed to strip away empathy, compassion, and every emotion that might interfere with their function as human weapons. But the agoge was only the beginning. At 18, they entered the crypteia, and this is where the system produced its most disturbing results. Officially, the crypteia was described as a secret police force responsible for controlling the Helot population, the enslaved Messenians who worked Spartan farms. In practice, it was something far more sinister. Each year, the ephors made a formal declaration of war against the Helots, a legal mechanism that allowed Spartans to kill them without religious pollution or blood guilt. During this period, Young Crypteia members were sent into the countryside with daggers and minimal supplies. Their mission was to hunt and kill helots, targeting particularly strong or intelligent individuals who might pose threats if they organized resistance. But these killings were not purely pragmatic. They were training exercises designed to teach young warriors how to kill human beings without hesitation, without remorse, without the psychological barriers that normally prevent people from taking life. For 2 years, these 18 and 20-year-old Spartans stalked human prey through the mountains and valleys of Laconia. They learned the intimate violence of blade work, the weight of a body going limp in their hands, the smell of blood, and the sound of final breaths. By the time they completed their Crypteia service, they had killed multiple times and experienced the systematic destruction of whatever capacity for empathy they had possessed at birth. This psychological conditioning was what made Spartan warriors so terrifyingly effective. Other Greek cities could replicate their physical training, their weapons, their tactics. What they could not replicate was the systematic elimination of normal human emotional responses, the creation of men who could inflict suffering without feeling it, who could treat human beings as objects without cognitive dissonance. These were the men who would determine the fates of captured Athenian women. These were the men who had been shaped since childhood to view certain categories of people as existing outside the moral framework that governed relations among Spartan citizens. These were the men who would implement the distribution system with the same mechanical efficiency they applied to everything else. The assignments reflected careful calculation rather than random cruelty. Household assignment meant becoming a secondary wife to a Spartan citizen, required to produce children who would belong to the state rather than to her. These children would be evaluated at birth and either accepted into the agoge or exposed on the mountainside if found wanting. But household assignment was not the only possibility. The Crypteia also had uses for captured women, purposes that ancient sources describe only in euphemisms that barely conceal their true nature. These women would provide education in techniques of interrogation and control, serving as training material for young warriors, learning to extract information and break resistance. Temple assignment might sound preferable, but the religious institutions of Sparta practiced forms of worship that Athens would have considered obscene. The women assigned to these temples found themselves participating in rituals that violated every principle of dignity they had been raised to value. The system was coherent, logical, addressing Sparta's demographic problems with ruthless efficiency. But for the women caught within it, coherence and logic provided no comfort. They faced a future where their bodies would be used according to state requirements, where their children would be taken from them, where their humanity would be reduced to biological function. Tomorrow, the assignments would be made. Tomorrow, Melina and the other captured women would learn exactly what their captors had planned for them. Tomorrow, they would discover whether they had been classified as breeding stock or training material, whether they would live in households or die in cells, whether survival was even possible in a system designed to consume everything they were. The dawn brought no mercy, only the methodical implementation of decisions made in darkness. Melina woke to the sound of bronze-studded sandals on stone, the rhythmic march of guards who came not to liberate, but to deliver verdicts written on wax tablets by men who viewed human suffering as administrative procedure. The courtyard filled again with the 32 captured women, but now they stood in different groupings. The sorting had begun during the night, while they slept fitfully on straw mats, their fates decided by assessors who weighed fertility against age, beauty against breeding potential, compliance against the entertainment value of resistance. Each woman bore a small clay token that marked her assignment, symbols that would determine whether she lived as property or died as entertainment. Melina fingered the token tied around her wrist, a household symbol, she realized with a mixture of relief and revulsion. She had been classified as suitable for breeding purposes rather than training material. Around her, other women examined their own tokens with dawning understanding of what the simple markings meant. Some wept quietly. Others stood in stunned silence. A few looked almost grateful, understanding as Melina did that in Sparta's hierarchy of horrors. Some fates were marginally better than others. The woman beside her, a baker's wife named Theodora, held a different token entirely, the mark of the Crypteia. Her hands shook as she stared at the clay symbol that sentenced her to purposes too terrible to contemplate directly. Melina wanted to offer comfort, but had already learned that displays of emotion attracted unwanted attention from their captors. Spartan efficiency extended to the management of grief itself. Gorgo, the Spartan woman who had explained the system the previous day, emerged from the colonnade with the same clinical detachment she had shown before. She carried a scroll containing the specific assignments, the names and households and purposes that would define these women's existence for whatever remained of their lives. When she spoke, her voice carried no more emotion than a merchant reading inventory. The household assignments came first. Melina listened as names were called, and Spartan citizens identified as new owners. Aristodama, wife of an Athenian ship captain, assigned to Brasidas, son of Tellus, whose previous wife had died in childbirth. Penthesilea, mother of 3 daughters, given to Alcibiades, son of Diomedes, who required heirs for his substantial property holdings. Each assignment included a brief explanation of requirements: immediate breeding, specific dietary modifications to enhance fertility, protocols for managing pregnancy and childbirth according to Spartan medical practices. When Melina's name was called, she stepped forward with as much dignity as she could maintain. Her assignment was to Cleomenes, son of Anaxandrides, a veteran of multiple campaigns whose first wife had died 2 years earlier. The description noted his need for legitimate heirs, his standing within the community of equals, his demonstrated capability as a provider. It sounded almost reasonable until the additional requirements were specified: availability to other citizens upon request, surrender of all children to state evaluation, compliance with breeding schedules determined by the ephors. But the household assignments, disturbing as they were, represented the merciful portion of Spartan processing. What came next revealed the true depths of the system's cruelty. The Crypteia assignments were read with the same administrative precision, but the purposes described made Melina's stomach clench with horror for the women whose tokens had marked them for different use. Theodora was assigned to Lysander, son of Aristocles, a Crypteia captain with specific educational requirements. She would provide instruction in interrogation techniques, serve as practice material for young warriors learning to extract information through physical persuasion, demonstrate the breaking points of foreign psychology for analytical purposes. The euphemisms barely concealed what these assignments actually meant: systematic torture disguised as military training. 3 other women received similar assignments, each to different Crypteia officers with specialized interests. One would teach young Spartans about the limits of human endurance. Another would demonstrate techniques for maintaining consciousness during extended questioning. The third would provide lessons in the psychological effects of prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. These women would suffer not because they had committed crimes, but because their suffering would educate the next generation of Spartan warriors in the arts of human destruction. The temple assignments seemed almost benign by comparison until Gorgo explained their true nature. The religious institutions of Sparta were unlike anything in the civilized Greek world. They practiced forms of worship that incorporated elements Athens would have recognized as belonging to the mystery cults, rituals that required participants to surrender not just their bodies, but their spiritual autonomy to practices designed to break down individual identity entirely. The women assigned to these temples would serve as sacred prostitutes, available to any Spartan citizen who wished to participate in fertility rites that supposedly honored Artemis, but actually provided religious justification for what was essentially institutionalized sexual exploitation. They would bear children who would be raised entirely within the temple system, trained from birth to serve the same functions their mothers had fulfilled. But even these horrors paled beside what happened to those women deemed unsuitable for any productive purpose. The elderly, the sick, those whose resistance during examination had marked them as potentially troublesome, received no assignments at all. They were simply led away by Crypteia guards to fates that Gorgo did not specify, but that everyone understood. Sparta had no use for unproductive mouths to feed. The mountain cliffs that claimed imperfect infants would claim imperfect captives as well. As the assignments were completed and the women separated into their designated groups, Melina caught a final glimpse of Theodora being led away by guards whose faces showed no more emotion than men collecting livestock for slaughter. Their eyes met for an instant, and in that moment, Melina saw not just terror, but a terrible understanding that death would have been infinitely preferable to what awaited her in the Crypteia cells. The household group was marched through Sparta's streets toward their new lives as human breeding stock. The city they passed through bore little resemblance to Athens, with its bustling agoras and philosophical schools. Everything here served military function. Buildings were constructed for durability rather than beauty. Public spaces were designed for troop formations rather than civic discourse. Even the temples looked more like fortresses than places of worship. Spartan citizens watched their passage with expressions of mild interest, the way farmers might observe the delivery of new livestock. Some made comments about the quality of the captives, assessing hip width and breast development with the casual expertise of men accustomed to evaluating breeding potential. Children stared with wide eyes, already learning that foreign women were commodities to be distributed according to state needs, rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity. The House of Cleomenes occupied a position of moderate status within Sparta's rigid social hierarchy. Stone walls without ornamentation, wooden furniture built for function rather than comfort, a central courtyard where the household gathered for meals and religious observances. It was smaller than Melina's home in Athens had been, but constructed with the same austere efficiency that characterized everything Spartan. Cleomenes himself stood waiting in the courtyard when she arrived, escorted by 2 Spartan women who positioned themselves behind her like guards. He was not handsome by Athenian standards, his features too sharp, his body too lean from years of military conditioning, his eyes holding the flat intensity that Melina was learning to recognize as typically Spartan. But there was something in his stillness that commanded attention. The coiled readiness of a predator momentarily at rest. He examined her without speaking, his gaze moving over her body with the same clinical detachment the assessors had displayed. This was not a man choosing a wife, but a farmer selecting breeding stock, evaluating the physical characteristics that would determine her value in producing the next generation of Spartan warriors. The examination was appropriate by Spartan standards, even necessary, but it reduced her humanity to biological function in ways that made her earlier life seem impossibly distant. When he finally spoke, his words confirmed what she had already understood about her position in this household. She was here to provide children, heirs who would enter the Agorge at 7 years old and either emerge as warriors or die in the attempt. Her cooperation was expected, her comfort irrelevant, her survival contingent entirely upon her ability to fulfill reproductive requirements that would be monitored by the state with the same attention they devoted to military logistics. But something in his manner suggested depths that his Spartan training had not entirely erased. When he mentioned her husband, referring to Hippocrates as a competent commander whose cavalry tactics had impressed even Spartan observers, there was a note of professional respect that humanized both men in ways the system discouraged. For just a moment, Melina glimpsed the possibility that her captor might retain enough humanity to make her survival bearable. That night, as she lay in the chamber that would become her prison and her refuge, listening to the sounds of a household settling into routines she would need to learn, Melina began planning not for escape, which was impossible, but for something more subtle and ultimately more subversive. She would survive by adapting, by finding ways to preserve her essential self while appearing to become what Sparta required her to be. The war had changed form, but it was not over. In the darkness of her new prison, surrounded by the tools of her own exploitation, Melina began the longest and most important campaign of her life. Not a battle for territory or glory, but a fight for the preservation of human dignity in a system designed to destroy it completely. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new demands, new tests of her ability to endure what should be unendurable. But tonight, she planned. The first weeks in Cleomenes' household unfolded with a rhythm that was both predictable and terrifying. Each morning brought the same routine: inspection by the household women who monitored her health with the attention livestock breeders devoted to valuable animals, meals calculated to optimize reproductive capacity, exercises designed to strengthen the muscles that would carry Spartan children. Every aspect of her existence was calibrated according to principles that reduced her humanity to biological function. But it was the nights that revealed the true nature of her captivity. When darkness fell and the household retired, Cleomenes would come to her chamber with the mechanical precision of a man performing necessary duties. There was no pretense of affection, no attempt at pleasure, no acknowledgement that what occurred between them was anything other than state-mandated reproduction. He approached her body the way a craftsman approached raw materials, efficient and purposeful, seeking only the result that Sparta required. What surprised Melina was not the clinical nature of these encounters, which she had expected, but the brief conversations that sometimes followed. In the darkness, after the functional coupling was complete, Cleomenes would occasionally speak about subjects that ranged far beyond military matters. He mentioned poetry, the verses of Tertius, that were the only art form Sparta officially permitted. He discussed agricultural yields and their implications for Laconia's long-term stability. He even referenced philosophical concepts that should have been foreign to Spartan thinking. These conversations revealed something unexpected about her captor. Despite his training, despite the systematic elimination of sentiment that the agoge was designed to accomplish, Cleomenes retained traces of intellectual curiosity that his society discouraged. He asked questions about Athenian practices, not from military intelligence gathering, but from what seemed like genuine interest in how other people organized their lives. He wondered aloud about the poets and philosophers that Athens produced, the art and architecture that made the city famous throughout the Greek world. Gradually, Melina began to understand that these discussions were not casual entertainment for a bored warrior. They were something more desperate, the intellectual hunger of a man who had been systematically denied the full range of human experience. Spartan citizens lived communally from childhood, surrounded by peers who shared identical training and identical values. They were never alone, but they were also never truly connected to others as complete human beings. The masks of Spartan virtue that they wore among their fellows prevented the kind of genuine exchange that Melina represented. She was property, which paradoxically gave her access to parts of Cleomenes that no Spartan citizen could reach. He could express doubts to her that would have been dangerous to voice among his peers. He could admit uncertainties that might have marked him as weak or unreliable in the eyes of the ephors. He could explore ideas that the Spartan system categorically rejected, because what did it matter what a captive Athenian thought about his private reflections? As the months passed, these nocturnal conversations became longer and more revealing. Cleomenes spoke about his childhood in the agoge, about friends who had failed the endless tests and been expelled or killed, about the Crypteia service that had required him to hunt human beings through the mountains of Laconia. He described the first man he had killed during his secret police training, a young helot who had looked at him with something approaching pity rather than fear in the moment before the blade went in. Most painfully, he spoke about his first wife, Lampito, whom he had chosen from among the eligible Spartan women and who had died in childbirth 2 years earlier. She had been, he revealed, the only person in his adult life with whom he had been able to speak honestly, the only relationship that had approached genuine human connection rather than the functional bonds that characterized Spartan society. Her death had left him isolated in ways that his training had not prepared him to handle. These revelations created a complex dynamic that Melina had not anticipated. She found herself becoming important to Cleomenes in ways that transcended her reproductive function, providing intellectual stimulation and emotional connection that he could find nowhere else in his rigidly controlled society. This was not love, certainly not on her part, but it was something more than simple captivity. It was a relationship, albeit one built on foundations of power and exploitation that could never be entirely overcome. More importantly, it was leverage. If Cleomenes came to depend on these conversations, on the unique form of companionship that she provided, he might be motivated to protect her beyond the basic requirements of maintaining valuable breeding stock. In Sparta's hierarchy of horrors, protection by a citizen in good standing could mean the difference between survival and destruction, between household assignment and transfer to the crypteia for training purposes. But this psychological manipulation required extraordinary care. Spartan men were trained to recognize and resist emotional manipulation, to view sentiment as weakness that could be exploited by enemies. If Cleomenes realized that she was deliberately cultivating his attachment, if he understood that her companionship was calculated rather than genuine, the consequences would be severe. She had to become genuinely interesting to him, while concealing the strategic purposes behind her interest in him. The balance was delicate and dangerous. Too much distance would leave her vulnerable to reassignment if she failed to conceive quickly enough. Too much intimacy would mark both of them as violating Spartan norms about appropriate relationships between citizens and property. She had to thread a path between these extremes, becoming valuable enough to protect, but not so valuable as to threaten the social order that made his protection meaningful. 3 months after her assignment to Cleomenes' household, Melina was summoned to appear before the ephors. She was not told why, simply escorted through Sparta's streets by 2 crypteia warriors whose hands rested casually on their daggers. The message was clear. This was not a social visit, but an evaluation that could result in immediate reassignment or worse. The ephors' chamber was austere, even by Spartan standards, containing only 5 chairs arranged in a semicircle, with a smaller seat positioned for those being examined or judged. 4 of the 5 magistrates were present when she arrived, their ages ranging from middle-aged to elderly, their faces bearing the scars and weathered features of men who had survived decades of warfare and political maneuvering. The questioning began immediately. Had she conceived? The answer was no. Despite 3 months of nightly use, despite careful attention to diet and exercise, despite every effort to fulfill her primary function. The ephors received this information with expressions that revealed nothing, but Melina understood that her value was being recalculated according to criteria that made failure to reproduce within specified timeframes a serious problem. But conception was not the only reason for her summons. The ephors had received a petition from another citizen, a request that they described as unusual enough to require consultation rather than automatic approval. Lysander, a captain in the crypteia, had formally requested access to Melina for purposes that would likely damage her breeding potential. He had offered substantial compensation to the state for this damage, indicating both his wealth and his determination to obtain what he wanted. The petition was disturbing not just for its content, but for what it revealed about Spartan legal mechanisms. Normally, such requests would be granted automatically, without consultation with the women involved. Property had no right to consent or object to its use. But Lysander's request was extreme enough that even the ephors hesitated, recognizing that granting it would eliminate Melina's productive value entirely, while denying it might offend a citizen with considerable influence within the crypteia hierarchy. Their solution was to transfer the responsibility to Melina herself, giving her a choice between accepting Lysander's use for one night with full knowledge of what it would cost, or refusing and remaining in Cleomenes' household under increased pressure to conceive quickly. This was not mercy, but administrative convenience, creating a situation where the outcome would be her own decision, and the ephors could not be blamed regardless of consequences. The choice was no choice at all. Lysander's reputation was well known among the women of Sparta, both citizen wives and foreign captives. He was a sadist whose appetites went far beyond the functional brutality that characterized normal Spartan treatment of property. The women given to him for training purposes rarely survived the experience, and those who did were left so damaged that they could serve no further productive function. Melina chose to remain with Cleomenes, accepting the pressure to conceive within the remaining 3 months of her evaluation period. The alternative was simply too horrific to contemplate, regardless of the consequences of potential failure. But the encounter with the ephors had revealed the precarious nature of her position, the multiple threats that surrounded her, the constant possibility that administrative decisions could destroy her, regardless of her own efforts to survive. That night, when Cleomenes came to her chamber, she did something unprecedented. Instead of passive acceptance, she participated actively in their coupling, moving with him, responding to his touch, creating the illusion of mutual desire rather than mere compliance. The deception was necessary for practical reasons rather than emotional ones. She needed to conceive, whatever it took, whatever it cost her psychologically. The alternative was Lysander and the training purposes that would end with her death. The months that followed brought a new intensity to her relationship with Cleomenes. The conversations continued, growing deeper and more revealing as he shared aspects of his inner life that no other Spartan would have understood or accepted. But now there was urgency beneath their exchanges, a recognition that time was running short and that failure to produce the required results would separate them permanently. Cleomenes began returning to the household earlier each day, spending more time in conversation with her, asking questions about Athenian life that revealed his growing fascination with alternatives to Spartan existence. He wondered what it would be like to live in a society where citizens could pursue individual interests, where men could choose their own occupations, where families remained together rather than being separated by state requirements. These discussions were dangerous territory, bordering on the kind of speculation that could mark a Spartan citizen as unreliable or insufficiently committed to traditional values. But they also revealed the depth of intellectual hunger that his training had never quite eliminated, the human curiosity that survived beneath layers of military conditioning. Melina encouraged these explorations carefully, asking questions that drew him out further, offering observations that challenged his assumptions without directly attacking Spartan principles. 6 weeks before Lysander's petition was scheduled to be reconsidered, the gods, or chance, or her body's desperate response to impossible pressure granted what she had been praying for. She missed her monthly bleeding, then waited 2 more weeks to be certain before reporting to the household physician. The examination confirmed what she already knew, but barely dared to hope. She was pregnant. The news reached the ephors within hours, officially recorded in their meticulous administrative records, and Lysander's petition was denied on grounds that the subject was now demonstrably productive and should not be damaged. But Melina understood that this protection was temporary. Pregnancy ended with childbirth, and childbirth was followed by evaluation of the infant and eventual return to breeding duties. Lysander's interest in her had not disappeared, but only been deferred until circumstances changed. For now, though, she was safe. She, the child growing inside her, the product of systematic exploitation by a man who had become something approaching a companion, provided protection against immediate threats while creating new ones for the future. She began planning not just for survival through pregnancy and childbirth, but for the years beyond, when she would need different forms of protection against different forms of danger. The war for her survival had entered a new phase, but it was far from over. In the darkness of her chamber, feeling the first subtle movements of new life, Melina continued the campaign that had begun with her capture. The fight to preserve something essentially human in a system designed to destroy humanity completely. The child was born in the spring, 7 months after the pregnancy was confirmed. A boy, healthy by initial inspection, with the dark hair that marked him as potentially acceptable to Spartan standards. The birth was attended by midwives who had delivered thousands of children for the state, women who treated Melina with the professional competence they would show any breeding animal. There was no celebration, no joy, only the mechanical efficiency that characterized every aspect of Spartan reproduction. 3 days later came the inspection that would determine whether her months of pregnancy had produced anything useful to the state. Council elders examined the infant with clinical detachment, checking limbs for straightness, joints for flexibility, measuring and weighing with instruments designed to identify weakness that might compromise future military service. The baby screamed at treatment that seemed deliberately harsh, as if his distress was itself being evaluated for signs of inadequate constitution. Melina watched from across the room, forbidden to hold her child during this assessment, forbidden to object if the elders found him wanting. The terror that filled her was beyond anything she had experienced since her capture. This child represented her only protection against Lysander, her only value to a system that measured worth in reproductive output. If the elders rejected him, if they carried him to Mount Taygetus to join the countless other infants deemed unworthy of Spartan resources, she would face immediate reassignment to purposes too horrible to contemplate. The elders conferred in voices too low for her to hear, their weathered faces revealing nothing as they debated the fate of her son. Finally, the eldest turned to face her and Cleomenes with an expression that might have been satisfaction or mere administrative completion. The child was acceptable. He would be registered as a future citizen, permitted to remain with his mother for the standard 2 years before beginning his journey through the agoge system that would either transform him into a weapon or destroy him entirely. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her legs nearly buckled. Her child would live, at least for now, at least long enough to be taken from her and molded into something she would barely recognize. In Sparta, this counted as mercy, as success, as the best possible outcome for a foreign woman whose only value lay in producing warriors for a state built on systematic brutality. The stories we tell ourselves about ancient Sparta focus on bronze shields and crimson cloaks, on 300 warriors holding the pass at Thermopylae, on sacrifice and honor and glory that poets still sing 2 millennia later. But those stories are lies of omission, myths that obscure the machinery of human exploitation that made Spartan military dominance possible. Tonight you learned what historians have spent centuries trying to forget, that behind every Spartan victory stood women like Melina, processed like livestock, reduced to reproductive function, their humanity systematically destroyed to feed a war machine that consumed everything it touched. The system that created these horrors did not emerge from individual cruelty, but from deliberate social engineering, generations of choices that prioritized military effectiveness over human dignity. The agoge that produced unbreakable warriors also produced men capable of treating captured women as breeding stock without psychological discomfort. The crypteia training that taught young Spartans to hunt human beings also prepared them to implement distribution systems with mechanical efficiency. Every aspect of Spartan society, from childhood brutalization to state-sanctioned murder, served the single purpose of maintaining control over a hostile population that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Understanding this machinery matters because similar systems have emerged throughout history whenever societies choose security over humanity, whenever efficiency becomes more important than empathy, whenever the preservation of one group requires the systematic destruction of others. The methods change, the technology advances, but the fundamental logic remains constant. Certain categories of people exist only for use by those with power to define human worth. Melina's story is not unique. Across the ancient world, across all of human history, countless women have faced similar fates with similar courage, finding ways to preserve their essential humanity in systems designed to eliminate it entirely. Their names are mostly lost, their stories deliberately obscured by histories written by those who benefited from their suffering. But their resistance echoes still in every choice, to remain human when humanity itself becomes a form of rebellion. The child sleeping in her arms carries both the blood of her Athenian ancestors and the genetic material that Sparta required for its survival. In him, the victim and the system that victimized her are forever intertwined, a living reminder that even the most brutal machinery of exploitation depends ultimately on the humanity it seeks to destroy. Whether that humanity survives depends on choices yet to be made by him and by every generation that follows. Because the truth is always more complex, always more disturbing, and always more important than the myths we prefer to believe.